When you think of the all-time great game music composers, a few names immediately jump to mind. Koji Kondo, Nobuo Uematsu, Jesper Kyd, David Wise, the usual suspects, men who have forged the musical identities of major gaming franchises, brought unique sounds and styles to the medium, and written some unforgettable tunes. They are all obviously completely deserving of this praise, but it's strange how it's an accolade seemingly reserved for men, especially considering just how many women have done exactly the same thing. In fact, since the very beginning, women have been integral in developing the sound of video game music and pioneering the genre. Before the Mario Overworld theme became a household tune, the domain of video games was the arcade. Arcade games in the early 80s featured music that was rudimentary at best. Repetitive, oscillating tones that could easily be mistaken for sound effects, and little jingles sprinkled throughout to punctuate, often just written by the game's own designers. However, there was one company in particular that was pushing the cabinet's audio capabilities: Namco. Yuriko Kano was one of the very first dedicated game music composers, premiering in April of 1982 with Namco's Dig Dug. This was an early title to feature legitimate background music during gameplay, and it even had a primitive dynamic audio system that would only play when the player moved, and sped up when there was only one enemy remaining on screen. Kano quickly followed it up with Xevious, scoring 2 of the most popular arcade games in the same year. But Kano wasn't alone at Namco. For Dig Dug's sequel, she was joined by Junko Ozawa, who made a name for herself in 1984 with the Tower of Druaga. This was a landmark title that not only established the fantasy genre as a mainstay of video games, but its soundtrack, with its heavy classical inspiration and unmatched orchestration, showcased the value of having a dedicated composer. It set a precedent moving forward, dramatically raising the bar for what was possible and expected out of video game music. It would only be a couple of years before Junko Ozawa's influence was undeniable, with the likes of The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy all building upon the foundations laid by the Tower of Druaga. It wasn't just Namco, though. Capcom's sound team was famous throughout the late 80s and 90s, not only for the strength of their compositions, but also for the fact that it was primarily made up of women. In 1987, Capcom introduced us to one of gaming's most iconic characters, Mega Man. Named Rockman in Japan after rock and roll, music has always been an important point of reference for the Blue Bomber. Manami Matsumae defined Mega Man's sonic identity, fusing catchy pop melodies with driving rock rhythms, and the harsh electronic sound palette of the NES only added to the robotic nature of the character. Matsumae's genre-blending style would not only influence the sound of video game music to come, but it was also a major progenitor of the chiptune scene, inspiring a new generation of young musicians to experiment with electronic music. While the Mega Man series has never held a single consistent composer, it has been primarily women who have continued Matsumae's legacy and helped Rockman live up to his name. Capcom were far from being a one-hit wonder though. In 1991, they single-handedly ushered in an arcade revival with the release of Street Fighter II. Capcom entrusted the soundtrack of their crown jewel to a young up-and-comer in the company named Yoko Shimomura. She was a perfect fit for the fighting game, having previously worked on a couple of their side-scrolling brawlers. But what truly separated Street Fighter II's soundtrack apart as exceptional was its diversity of sound, with a roster of characters from all across the world and theme songs inspired by the musical flavours of their homeland. Street Fighter II revealed Shimomura as one of the most diverse and broadly talented game composers of her time, which is essentially the entire history of video games. She is one of the only game composers I can think of who was active in the 80s and still to this day writing entire soundtracks. Most recently, Kingdom Hearts 3. While she is perhaps now most famous for mastering the impossible sound of the endearing yet outrageous Disney JRPG hybrid, throughout her prolific career she has ranged from chiptune beat-em-ups and survival horror titles, to epic orchestral fantasies and light-hearted Mario games. Yoko Shimomura is by far the hardest working, most prolific, diverse and yet consistent game composer in history. The Donkey Kong Country series is famous for having some of the most beautifully atmospheric soundtracks out there. Composer David Wise deserves every drop of praise that he receives for them. That is, except for all the tracks he didn't write. Eveline Novakovic, née Fischer, is commonly overlooked as one of the original trilogy's composers. She wrote some of the first game's finest tracks, including the map theme Simian Segway, the ambient Ice Cave chant, and fan favourite Voices of the Temple. She was also the primary composer of the third game, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. She's so good, you didn't even realise she wasn't David. And this is a common story for women working in the industry, in which their work is often mistaken for that of a man's. This is especially true in the West for Japanese composers, whose names may not be obviously feminine to the untrained Western eye. Take Minako Hamano, for instance. She helped compose the soundtrack to Super Metroid, but is commonly mistaken for a man, or just forgotten altogether in favour of Kenji Yamamoto, even though she wrote some of the game's most enduring tracks, such as Ridley's theme. Minako Hamano is also responsible for the soundtracks of the most underrated titles for two of Nintendo's biggest series, Metroid Fusion and The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. These are easily among the most celebrated games on the Game Boy system and soundtracks of their respective franchises. Minako Hamano truly is Nintendo's hidden weapon. There's also the case of women being credited under a male or ambiguous pseudonym. Castlevania's score was credited to James Banana, who was actually two women, Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima. James Banana being a goofy reference to Dracula composer James Bernard. Blending dark gothic classical music with groovy modern rock, Banana's music set a distinct tone that was perfectly Castlevania and unlike anything else from a video game. With the series growing famous for its unmistakable musical identity, the reins of its soundtracks were eventually entrusted to Michiru Yamane, who gave the franchise its magnum opus soundtrack in Symphony of the Night. The PlayStation's advanced hardware allowed for a fully realised version of the established goth rock style, with Yamane pushing it even further into metal, and bringing her own distinct voice with some atmospheric lo-fi synth pop. Crystal Teardrops is basically a vaporwave song 25 years before the genre even existed. Michiru Yamane would go on to compose 5 more soundtracks for the Castlevania series, creating an immortal musical legacy. In fact, a number of the longest-running video game franchises have had women at the helm of their soundtracks from the very beginning. Fire Emblem may have only caught the attention of the West in the past decade, but it's been a hit in Japan ever since its debut in 1990. Yuka Tsujiyoko was the sole composer on every Fire Emblem game until the mid-2000s, a job for which she now supervises a team of people. Japanese RPG series Suikoden had its music spearheaded by Miki Higashino, and just like Castlevania, would be picked up by Michiru Yamane. And Jun Chikuma has brought us close to 20 different soundtracks for the Bomberman series, ranging from the Arabic folk-flavoured electronica of its early titles to the modern UK club music jungle and atmospheric drum and bass of Bomberman Hero. A terrible game that's now a cult classic solely off the back of its terrific soundtrack. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list of women game composers. If it were, I would mention the likes of Soyo, whose soundtrack for Super Mario Kart defined the sound of the kart racer for decades to come, and so many others who have just written incredible music for great games. It's just meant to highlight those composers and franchises that pushed the medium forward in its early years. But even to this day, women are still pioneering video game music and taking it to brand new places. Jessica Curry was the co-founder, co-director, and composer for The Chinese Room, the developers responsible for the experimental games Dear Esther and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which rely heavily on their musical score to tell the story. Jessica is also a major advocate for video game music through her radio show High Score on the UK's Classic FM, helping to bring the genre into legitimacy with other forms of orchestral music. Winifred Phillips, who has written for series such as Assassin's Creed, God of War, and Little Big Planet, wrote a textbook titled A Composer's Guide to Game Music, which is used in major universities to teach students VGM composition. She literally wrote the book on video game music. The legacy that all these women have left is immense, and cannot be ignored or erased. They have consistently been at the forefront of the industry, innovating in game music design, forging the musical identities of major gaming franchises, bringing previously unexplored styles and a diversity of sound to the genre, and just writing some iconic, unforgettable tunes. Women were just as much the pioneers of video game music. It's time that we finally recognize them as such.